Okay, Jim.
Okay. All right, what we're going to do today, this is going to be a special program of cyber power of Tigray. We've done it before, but what we're interested today, what I'm going to present today, actually was inspired by a popular request. So many people told me we got to do something about this because certain people are campaigning at this point in history. That's not correct and that's distorted. So since you have done it before, why don't you do it today? And I said to them, I'm going to do it. So promise is promise. I'm going to do it. I've done it. So the title is The History of Tigray, 17th Century to Present. Actually, I do have courses that I teach in the college and the university where I am, that modern history of nations actually began, in most instances, in the 1800s. But I have done it on purpose with respect to Tigray, that it should start in the 17th century instead of 1800. Why? Because the controversy that we have today on the disputed territories. It should begin way back to the 1620s. And I am going to present that today. I hope people will get something out of this. And if you have questions to the audience I'm talking about now, especially the diaspora young Ethiopians, young Tagaru, that they should really know about this thing. Even the opposition, that they might not buy my point of view, should also listen carefully, because it's not with the verbosity that we can come to terms. History is the biggest judge of all. We do not make history, we do not coin it, we do not fabricate it. It has its own evolutionary process. And based on that, therefore, I'm going to read it actually, what I wrote for today. So the title is The History of Tigray, 17th Century to Present. In this brief historical account of Tigray, I'm going to systematically address the genuine and authentic history of Tigray, based mostly on documentary evidence and up-to-date new revelations and discoveries that I haven't had a chance to get hold of such historical narratives when I first wrote about Tigray in 2004, and subsequently interviewed by the VOA, Voice of America Tigrinya, on the same subject matter. That's way back and early the supporting evidence to my thesis that I will present in this essay are also supported and substantiated by linguistic, cultural, as well as my own eyewitness account, especially of the so-called disputed territories of Western Tigray. We are lucky enough to have significant documents and chronicles written by several European travelers to Ethiopia in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, who in most cases have sojourned in Tigray and furnished first-hand information about Tigray. Among these early travelers is the Portuguese missionary by the name Manuel Baradas, who lived in Fromena. Fromena is a small town-like village between Adwa and Aksum in the 1620s and 1630s. Baradas' book, first written in Portuguese in 1634. As a matter of fact, I have the book right here. This is his book, excellent book, 1634. We're talking about 400 years ago. First written in 1634 and then translated into English by Elizabeth Fuller and edited by the late Richard Pancras, is entitled A 17th Century Historical and geographical account of Tigray, Ethiopia. Among all the kingdoms that the emperor of Ethiopia possesses today, says Baradas, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, and most important is the kingdom of Tigray. The editor of the book, Pancras, based on the historical facts provided by the travelers, tells us that Almeida described Tigray as the foundational head of the entire Ethiopian monarchy, considered it still the best part of the country, while Ludolf later described it as the best and the most fertile part of it. The province began, Almeida says, at the twin Red Sea ports of Massawa and Hergega, and extended southeastwards along the coast as far as the tiny harbor of Dafalo. Inland, the province was bordered from east to west by the Danakil kingdom, Angot, Doba, Begemudur, and Simin. The above supporting documents were authored by Buckingham and Huntingford, and their book is entitled Some Records of Ethiopia, and by J. Ludolf, A New History of Ethiopia, 1682. The most important contribution of Baradas, however, is the early 17th century map of Tigray that shows the many names of districts from Hamasen and the Dahlak Islands in the north to Doba or Aloha Melash in the south. The map was here. I could not share it. I don't know where the map is. But anyway, okay, here we go. The one that you see on your left-hand side, the white and black one, is Daniel Baradas' map, 17th century one. The one on the right, of course, is modern map of Tigray. The one, as we shall see, in fact, the one on the right, which is present-day Tigray, is almost 1/4 of that, of the other one. So I'm going to explain that first. So, what Baradas provided, I calculated it actually. So what happened was I found out that it is around 80,000 square kilometers, that of Baradas. Present-day Tigray, which is only 20,000, sometimes it's less than 20,000 only. So you can see that it's only 1/4 of Baradas' map. Later, I'm going to succinctly explain why Tigray has now a relatively small stature. However, I shall explicate the geography of Tigray later. Some travelers, in fact, have documented that the Simeon Mountains stretching up to Matama, bordering Sudan. And if this is validated by documentary evidence, the total area of Tigray in the early 17th century, this is beyond Baradas' map now. The last quarter of the 19th century, when Emperor Johannes reigned, would be 112,000 square kilometers. That Baradas, slightly over that of Baradas, okay? So modern Tigray at the very end of this essay. Another eyewitness account of Baradas that I found quite interesting and original in its presentation is concerning the resources of Tigray. This is how Baradas depicts Tigray. And because this kingdom, by the way, he calls kingdom to all the other, it means like province actually in his terminology. It doesn't mean a country, independent country, or something like a kingdom. It's so much in resources of water. And because this kingdom is so rich in sources of water, it does not lack strong showers in certain areas, which help make the land even more productive and affluent with the advent of winter. Moreover, the summer showers bring harvests not only of barley, but of wheat, which grows very well here. and food crops like vegetables. There are even some areas where barley grows well watered only by the dew. It's a type of barley usually kept for need, and that is its best use. I must say that in all the lands I have traveled, and even in the small portion of the world I have visited, I have found none so gentle, favorable, and fitted to human life as Ethiopia, and in particular this kingdom of Tigray, because it has neither excessive cold nor heat, nor anything noxious to human life, such as not being usually being unhealthy and never being plague-ridden, and finally because nothing is lacking in it for a man to live contented, happy, and satisfied. So not with too many luxuries, which besides being unnecessary to life cause illness and weaken the human body and leave it incapable of enduring work. Moreover, Barada's eyewitness account of Tigray continues with respect to food crops. This kingdom has a great abundance of crops, both of the types found in Portugal. Remember, Baradas is Portuguese, so he's comparing Tigray with Portugal, and in India, as well as some peculiar to it, for it has a large of good quality wheat in various places. Barley, grains, lentils, beans, smaller varieties of beans. It produces sesame, sorghum, and a variety of ordinary crops. Linseed, which they only use as a starch. Native to the land is tefo. Baradas call it tefo, but it's tough. They have a seed which is called nuga, to mean nehug, from which they extract oil. They have two kinds of maize. One is white and commonplace. Another is red and is better for drinking than eating because they make it into a drink. They call sava. He wants to say suwa. There are distortions because he came up with his own accent, Portuguese accent. There is no less of abundance of meat. In fact, cows and oxen are so plentiful that it is in cattle that the people of Ethiopia measure their happiness and wealth. There are many men who have 2,000 or 3,000 cows, and sometimes many more, because they can reach 10,000 according to the possibilities of each person, without speaking of the oxen with which they plow, which are not counted. Okay, we don't need the maps anymore. Many goats are raised through the kingdom, whose milk only the children and shepherds, who are always young men, drink. Grown-ups never do. Sheep and lambs are abundant. Most of them are black, but there are places which also have white ones, and even those of the type known as 5 quarters because of the large tail. Baradas tells us that there were wild boars which were hunted for food, but the asamas, hasama, hare, and rabbits were not eaten, although they are extraordinarily large and plentiful. He also indicates that there were 4 types of quail and no lack of partridges, domesticated ducks, and wild ducks. There are also others called Portuguese chickens, perhaps because they are the ones who eat them. They have the feet of a chicken, an unusually large curved beaks, and the meat provided that is rather dark is very tasty. There are so many cows. There is a great abundance of butter, which is why it is taken to Massawa in vast amounts, to be bartered quite apart from the amount that is locally consumed. eaten and drunk, and used to treat the hair of both men and women, which for them is a glory and a pleasure. This kingdom is also very rich in very good honey. The best is from Enderta and Agame, as it is very flavorful and as white as snow. The swarms and beehives are kept inside their own houses. They raise them, as this keeps them safe from thieves. In various parts of this realm, much good quality iron is found, from which they make swords, daggers, spearheads that seem to be made of steel. According to Richard Pancras, Almeida took a similar view, observing, "There is plenty of iron in all the kingdom, and in some parts of it is as good as fine steel. But they do not know how to temper steel, they value it less," quoted in Buckingham and Huntingford. Baradas comments on the abundance of gold in Tigray and the imported clothing from India that the nobleman, middle class, and those of the common people wear. And all of it must be necessity pass through the ports of this kingdom. There are no others than those of Arkiko to mean Hergigo, Defalo, and Danakil, most likely Beilul, and everything taken from there. Here we say Dembiano and something that had to do with, and everything taken from there is forced to go through the lands and administration subject to Tigrai. It is in fact absolute master of all commerce, so that regardless of whether those from Dembia try to come, as many do come, to buy clothing from India, or those from Tigray take it down to them. It is always Tigray which remains master of the gold from those areas, as well as of the other wealth they have there. Thus, insofar as salt and clothing is concerned, they are dependent on Tigray, being unable to dress or to eat except by its hand. This salt that is cut into blocks is sometimes made into large chunks, 5, 6, or more times larger than the usual ones. Baradas calls this kind of salt ganfore or ganfur, an inferior type of salt as opposed to the amole, packed on mule bags and given to cattle to eat. And as Pancras' testimony of this salt also comes from the Italian traveler Tancredi in his La Missione della Società Geografica Italiana in Ethiopia, or Latino della Società Geografica Italiana, 1908. Deducting from Manuel Baradas' overall presentation of Tigray, Pancras describes in a footnote of the superiority of Tigray and puts it this way. The superiority of Tigray in firearms was noted almost a century and a half later by James Bruce, who, echoing Baradas, observed what in special manner makes the riches of Tigray is that lies nearest to the market, which is Arabia. All merchandise destined to cross the Red Sea must pass through this province, so that the governor has the choice of all commodities wherewith to make his market firearms. Moreover, which for many years have decided who is the most powerful in Abyssinia. All this comes from Arabia, and not one can be purchased without his knowing to whom it goes. And after his having had the first refusal of it, quoted in James Bruce Travels, on the gradual increase of firearms in Ethiopia prior to the 19th century. Pancras' article, The History of Firearms in Ethiopia prior to the 19th century, is highly recommended. And you can read it in Ethiopia Observer, 1967, volume 11, page 225. One other British traveler that came to Tigray in the 1800s is Nathaniel Pierce. And as I write on him in my book, Ethiopia Democracy, Devolution of Power in the Developmental State, that was published in 2013, Pierce sojourned in Ethiopia during the first decade of the 1800s, or more specifically, during the era of princes, and when Ras Walda Selassie was the chief lord of Tigray. And he documented, among other things, his encounter on how Ethiopian farmers, or more specifically, the farmers of Tigray, harvested rice from their irrigated farms. This is how he put it then. Moi, to mean my Lomen is a beautiful narrow river which rises in different mountains of Semen and runs very rapidly into the Takaza. My Lomen signifies water of limes. Many sour oranges and vast quantities of limes grow in different spots of garden ground for several miles in its vicinity. It is a deep valley, not in the least affected by the cold from the mountains. A great deal of cotton is cultivated on the banks of the river. It is watered by cats from above, or small channels about 2 feet wide, which run along the sides of the mountain and enable the inhabitants to water the ground with little trouble. In all parts of Abyssinia, indeed, during the dry season, the lands are watered in a similar manner. When near the rivers, and some grounds frequently grow 2 crops of any sort of grain. The corn that is obtained in the dry seasons by irrigation is called in Tigray Taf Agi. Actually, he meant to say Taf Hagai. But this corn is not so much esteemed as Taf Karampa. Taf Karampa means Kramti. There's so much distortion in here. Taf Kramti, which is the corn produced after the rains have fallen. With the above background to the history of 17th to the 19th century Tigray, I can now delve to the history of Tigray and the controversy on the so-called disputed territories between the Tigray regional state and the Amhara regional state. And based on eyewitness accounts and documentation, I shall critically examine the many data pertaining to the disputed zones and succinctly analyze relevant points in order to substantiate my arguments. Apparently, this kind of controversy or dispute over land may resonate land inheritance or possession of the medieval period, and it is unfortunate Ethiopians must go through an all-out war and bloodshed for land. But I must render justice, at least from historical and jurisdictional dimensions, so that the present generation of Ethiopians understand, and the curious non-Ethiopian learn regarding the place in history and propriety of the disputed lands. The question under discussion takes a moment's reflection, but it also requires an in-depth historical narrative from travelers' accounts. But before I present the latter's eyewitness records, I must dispel some misconceptions about the claims of the chauvinists and on the so-called disputed territories. First and foremost, the disputed areas, namely Walqait, Sagade, Salamti, and Raya, are all in Tigrinya-speaking territories. The Amhara disgruntled elements define them as Amhara, superimposing their identity onto the native Tigrayans. Secondly, there is appalling ignorance of the history and geography of the disputed lands as to when they were part of Amhara and when they were part of Tigray. The fallacy of their arguments contradicts the history, culture, and language of the inhabitants of this area. And for the sake of clarification, I will delineate the foundation of the realities on the ground based only on historical facts, but also on the psychological makeup and identity of the people. Thirdly, although it has become a standard practice of the flag-waving charlatans to claim and restore the lands via irredentism and violence due to the inherent biases and subjectivity, they were unable to provide any credible evidence as to why those lands were theirs. A claim of flawed pieces that don't fit together, which, by the way, I want to label them Mickey Mouse political adventures. Some Ethiopians are genuinely puzzled because, as I have stated earlier, they are ignorant of their history, let alone of the disputed territories. But the die-hard diaspora elements and their compatriots that are now serving as advisors to the Abiy regime deliberately distort the history, but their hypocrisy and pretenses did not serve them well. That's why they have resorted to ethnic cleansing in the disputed area and genocide in Tigray. This engagement in bloodshed, including cruel massacres and barbaric killings of their targets, the Tigrayans. I shall now make proximate explanation of the central thesis of this essay, which in essence is a corollary of my view, or in plain language, forming a proposition that follows from one already proved. That is to say, from what I wrote before and what had been attested by several writers, documents, and testimonials that support the Walqait, Sagade, Salamti, and Raya were historically part of Tigray. The first proof is that Walqait was ruled and governed by a Tigrayan aristocrat by the name Dagesmati Galaudios. Apparently, he shares my name. I share his name rather, because he was before me. In the 1620s, when Emperor Suetonius was emperor of Ethiopia, he governed Walqait, Sarai, now in Eritrea, and Shire, now part of Tigray, as one large province as part of his dominion. The second proof comes from a book entitled Nubia and Abyssinia by Michael Russell, in which he states Walqait and Waldeba are part of Tigray. Russell, in no uncertain terms, describes central Tigray and other areas by a list of Tigray district names as follows: Hagame, Nderta, Wajrat, Ofla, Lasta, Abergele, Semen, Tembien, Shire, Walqait, Waldeba. This is Michael Russell. The third proof is that of Manuel de Almeida that I have mentioned earlier. He is contemporary of Manuel Baradas, author of History of Ethiopia, who was in Tigray in 1622 and writes that Tigray begins at the twin ports of Massawa and Hergigo. In the same vein, like Baradas, Almeida says, the border of Tigray in the east is the Donkali, which is present-day Afar, and Simeon Begemudir in the west. Almeida's account of Tigray is incorporated in Cunningham and Huntington's book, Some Records of Ethiopia, 1593 to 1646. The fourth proof comes from J. Ludolf, author of A New History of Ethiopia, and he illustrates the 27 districts of Tigray, including Wag. The fifth proof is furnished by Balthazar Tellez, who describes, this is a missionary, Balthazar Tellez, who describes the districts of Tigray in Encyclopedia Ethiopica, Volume 4. Interestingly, Tellez, writing about the highest mountains in Ethiopia, says that these mountains are snow-topped and are found in the district of Semen, which is part of Tigray. What Tellez defines Semen as part of Tigray is corroborated by another administrative evidence during Emperor Johannes. During the reign of Emperor Johannes and beyond, Semen was administered by the emperor's appointees, first by Ras Dagana, after whose name we have Mount Dagana. Dashan is a corrupted term, actually, corrupted term from Dagana. Later by Ras Hagos, followed by Ras Guksaraya, and finally by Ras Siyum Mengesha. The fifth evidence, the sixth evidence comes from Henry Salt and simply corroborates proof number 5. In his book, A Voyage to Abyssinia, 1814, Henry Salt says, on top of Semen, areas such as Bekla, Boji, Takuwe, he calls it land of Shankala, were administered under Tigray. As I have insinuated earlier, Salt's account can help us define the geographical extent of Tigray in the 19th century to be 102,000 square kilometers. Salt also says that Tellez's account is the most accurate. The seventh evidence is that of John Houghton. In his book entitled Abyssinia and its People, writes about Tigray. But what I found it interesting is his account on what he calls majestic and graceful monasteries of Tigray, including Aksum, Walduba, Devra Damo, and Devra Abai. On top of the above 7 documentary evidence, we have testimonials from elderly high-ranking Tigrayan officials during Emperor Haile Selassie. Testimonial 1, Prince Ras Mengesha Siyum. And he says in an interview, before me, and as I know it well, my lord Ras Siyum used to administer Wolkite and Sagede. These 2 districts were relocated to Begemudir in 1948 and Kobo to be part of Wollo by order of the Minister of Interior in 1949. The order was promulgated in those 2 years. Before that, everybody knows what Tigray administrative extent was. And the history I know is that the territories were under Tigray. This is Ras Mengesha Siyum. Testimonial 2 is Fitaurari Muz Bayene, was a member of the Ethiopian parliament and advisor to the Emperor Haile Selassie. And he says, the border of Tigray is Aluhamelash, and Aluhamelash means the river near Waldia. Kobo was given to the region to the throne, or heir to the throne, Asfaha Wasan, with the assumption that he could administer a large dominion. During that time, Kobo was administered as part of Tigray by Ras Siyum Mengesha. This happened during my lifetime, says Fitaurarim Uzbayene. Testimonial 3 is Rastafari Mokannan, later Emperor Haile Selassie. When he was still heir to the throne, or regent, under Empress Zodito, Rastafari Mokannan, in anticipation of incorporating districts from Tigray, stated this phrase in his book, My Life and the Progress of Ethiopia, Volume 1. 8 days after the official coronation of Empress Zodito, on Yekatit 11 Ethiopian calendar, Ras Wolde Giorgis was promoted to the rank of Nugus after the empress put a throne on his head and became the king of Gondar. And for his kingship, Tigrai was given to him as part of his dominion. This is Emperor Haile Selassie. He was then known as Rastafari, of course. So, in terms of historical evidence, I put in the foregoing, there is no doubt that the disputed territories were part of Tigray. Have they been administered under Begemudur during Emperor Haile Selassie and under Gondar during the Derg military government? The answer is in the affirmative. And there is no doubt that Wolkite was under Gondar from 1948 to 1991. So was Kobo, that was administered under Wollo from 1949 to 1991. But because Ethiopia was restructured by the Constitution of 1995 based on language, ethnicity, and identity, it would be logical to assume that Kobo becomes part of Tigray, that Wolkite becomes part of Tigray. Again, same logic applies to Salamti, because this landmass was given to Emperor Taitu after the Battle of Adwa by Emperor Menelik. Kompo has not been returned to Tigray because the majority of the residents since its incorporation in 1949 are Amharic speakers. If we see the language and cultural dimension, however, as witnessed by me after temporarily residing in Salamti, I have encountered Tigrinya names of village, districts, lakes, as well as of names of people. Here are some names. My Gaba, my Cha'a, my Timkat, my Humar, my Tsamri, Belasa Qo'ah, Haddi Falho, Kalema, Magu, Haddi Ramas, Haddi Gaba, Belamba Mikael, Belamba Qurshi, Kulita, Bet Mulu, Ruba Kamin, Kasad Delasa, Salam, Ndabo, Salasa Aina, Adwarqi, Aura, Walal, Dabra Mariam, Midrway Zoro, Shirella, Dejana. These are the names. This quite reflects what kind of territory the Wolkite Sagadi and Salamti area is. So actually, it's with this that I conclude, but what I want to say now is this. I just presented as a scholar what I found out, without bias to anyone. However, my wish is that we, at long last, enjoy peace and stability. Ethiopians deserve to enjoy peace and stability. We have to abandon this nonsense of claiming lands and bloodshed and war and killings and burnings and what have you. Total destruction. It's very sad. So I suggest that something has to come out. I don't expect anything out of the current regime that's presiding over the political affairs of Ethiopia. However, if some sensible people come to the forefront, especially educated Ethiopians, they have to really propose a peaceful resolution to the conflict. That's the only way out. We can add the Constitution. Although the Constitution practically is now uh, beyond damage, but it's still in existence, at least theoretically. So that one could also be one of the mechanisms to resolve the dispute. People have to come to their senses and say, enough is enough. Enough is enough. The destruction is actually wiping out historic Ethiopia, and we're going to be in trouble. And like it or not, Ethiopians have to recognize that the origin of everything is Tigray. You can't even write the history of Ethiopia without Tigray. So these silly people, stupid people, have gone to Tigray to destroy Tigray and Tigrayans. They don't know that they have actually destroyed their own history, their own identity, their own origins. They don't know that. It's unfortunate. So I call upon the people who can make sense, people who can contribute something to the peaceful resolution of the conflict. Thank you all for listening. Good day.
Thank you, Dr. Galadios. It was a great history, and we do appreciate that. I think
Good day.
we don't have time to ask you more questions. I think you have
No, I think it's almost done. 1 hour.
everything good. So thank you so much for watching.
It was good.
Tigrai Media.
Thank you.